Okay, so to round out this panel, our last presenter is Seavitt Nordenson. She is a landscape architect who is really involved in working in really large-scale sedimentary environments and climate adaptation.
Thank you to the Dredge Collaborative for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here and see so many people interested in dredge, one of my favorite mucky things. As was noted, my name is Seavitt. I work with collaborative teams looking specifically at sea level rise and climate change adaptation, and in a local sense, how we can use dredge from a particular place and the way it tends to move to achieve some of those adaptive purposes. So I'm going to present briefly three projects that we've been working on recently. The first one is for New York Harbor, the second for the Mississippi Delta, and the third for the Yangtze Delta in China. The first project is for the upper harbor of New York, the New York Harbor Upper Bay, and we were looking at how could we present something that would be a different kind of approach to climate change, which was not a hard engineered solution. So we didn't look to storm gates or surge barriers, but rather to a series of iterative infrastructures that we called soft infrastructures. What we did with each research project is first create a digital model of a continuous bathymetric topographic model, which you're seeing on the right. So we conceive of the land as a continuous surface. The dredge is just another kind of earth. You just don't happen to see it because there's a vessel of water. It's a vessel that contains a volume of water above it. And of course, this region, this shows in dark green the hurricane tracks from the last 150 years. The darker green lines are hurricanes that achieved landfall, and we've had some close calls here after the initiation of this project, which we published in 2010, and I believe Irene was the next year. So this is from the book On the Water Palisade Bay. Of course, New York has had a quite compressed relationship between water and land as the city developed over time. That boundary between water and land became compressed into a line, and this, as you can see in this section, it's essentially a seawall with a granite face which encircled most of the island of Manhattan and much of Brooklyn and New Jersey as well. We were thinking about how can you consider that line to be broken down into a continuous gradient rather than a impermeable barrier, one that could be more adaptive and fluid. And here you see, of course, the slosh map, the hurricane map, which shows you the extent of storm surge from hurricanes scaled from 1 through 4, the highest being the red line. You may remember these from the Irene charts. And of course, then the kind of bathtub model of the 100 and 500-year flood in orange and red. So we really started to think about the coastline as a dynamics thing, not a line between water and land, but rather something much more fluid. And we traced that over about 100 years from NOAA charts, and became very interested in these areas of fringe along the edge of the old piers, as well as shallows and flats, which are sometimes called anchorages, which is where the shallow areas where boats would anchor. So we thought about that fringed edge as well as the shallows in the bay itself as places for intervention. So we studied with physical modeling and water what would happen if you extruded and extracted slips and piers, and what would happen if you used islands or a series of an archipelago of, in this case, we were looking at Tenkate tubes to help divert and churn up storm surge to divert the wave energy. So we looked at a series of strategies on increasing wetland, perimeters, extending and extracting slips, archipelago of small caisson islands or tube islands filled with local clean dredge. And then the combination of those things, including how the upper harbor could become an ecologically rich as well as a place for people to gather and join on the water in the center of the region instead of at the edges. So here also we looked at how energy could also be something that could be harvested through wind. This is the adaptive reuse of subway trains on the New Jersey shore for living reefs. We have oyster racks interspersed with both tidal turbines and, of course, wind turbines. A view from Sunset Park where we would start to look at bioswaling and the extraction of slips in order to absorb some of the increased water flow during storms. And, of course, the archipelago of islands, in this case, the scene from Staten Island, a series of caisson islands looking back towards Manhattan. All of these things would dampen storm energy within the water column and reduce the impact of storm surge. It certainly by no means would prevent flooding from occurring, but we see it as a kind of the softer infrastructure approach starts to look at how can you actually use nature as a way to work with rather than against impacts of flooding. And these are the 10 tube designed for the lower Manhattan, looking at offshore islands as a way of deflecting storm energy and pulling back the seawall to expose a wetland edge, graded edge, so you still protect downtown, but you also have a green edge. This work also went to Venice for the Biennale 2 years ago. We were very implicit about our idea was to really show that continuous surface of ground, so we devised a way of showing the ground as a continuous surface and basically elevating like a chandelier the water above it with an extended sea level rise indicator of dark green here, what the extent of that water would be over time with increased sea levels. The second project is looking at the Mississippi River Delta, and this is again looking at sediment, but using the sediment that exists to rechannel it into multiple diversions to actually gain land instead of lose land, which is what's happening now in the Delta region. Of course, this is also very fraught with many hurricane strikes. This is Katrina. And the Army Corps has a huge jurisdiction over the river. As you can see, all of their districts up the Mississippi River, which of course drains over 1 million square miles of the North American continent. In 1944, one of their engineers, Fisk, created these maps of the geological time of the Meander belt of the Mississippi River. About 15 years later, they created this much different drawing of the Mississippi for the project design flood, which looked particularly at the volumes of water that would come down the Mississippi and how much would be diverted into what outfalls and tributaries. So there's a much easier way of kind of calculating within a channel. So this is what happens. The river is channelized and diverted through control structures like this, river control, and this has resulted in a huge loss of wetlands for various reasons. Sea level rise is one, but of course there's saltwater intrusion from the cutting of canals, and the fact that there's no longer any sediment deposit because everything's being channeled all the way down through that foot at the right, with the exception of the Atchafalaya Basin here, which is where 30% of the water is diverted. So this is looking at the kind of historic deltaic swing of the Mississippi River Delta. We use that as a kind of place to locate where we might put additional diversions to use sediment beneficially to create land. This flood control plan shows the Atchafalaya floodway, which you see shaded here, where 30% of the water is converted, 70% is sent down through the Port of New Orleans and into the Delta. The one place in the region which has actually been gaining land is at the Wax Lake Delta. And you can see this at the far left. It's actually been built through the fact that there's actually water being pumped out through that. You have some accretion of land occurring at that site. So using that as an idea to channel the forces of nature and sedimentation itself to open up more diversions, we looked at 5 sites which could be used to open and allow different numbers than this kind of typical 30%, 70% annual flow, but changing to again, 37, but then divert some things within the Atchafalaya Basin, or to take other sites as well, to switch 40-60, send more down the Atchafalaya and open up in Davis Pond, or to even go 50-50 between at the control, the old river control structure, and start to replenish some delta areas closer to New Orleans. These are the 5 sites which we looked at. This was also part of the exhibition in Venice, so we looked again at the continuous topographic surface of the ground, particularly lacy and very, very small threshold between water and land, and modeling what the water is like and how the diversions could actually start to be building land, which you're seeing in yellow there. The last project which we're working on now is a proposal for the Yangtze River Pudong Delta. Again, looking at kind of the history of how sedimentation has formed land over time. It's a very sedimenty river, as you can see here in this image. This is where Shanghai is. So that from this historic map, you're seeing the Huangpu River, which separates Puxi and Pudong. Pudong is this kind of projection to the east. And over time, if you watch this coastline, it's been gradually accreting outward in these kind of sedimentary plains called Shenye. This is how it's changed since 1886 from our mapping. And this image shows you where some of those, historically, where those, like geologically history, these chenies occurred, which are essentially shell ridges that are basically overtopped storm after storm to accrete the land outward. So we saw that as a way of also becoming a preventative strategy for surges. And there's another kind of low-tech phenomena, obviously in China, of bunding for rice paddies, which also creates a kind of terrace-like system. And of course, we looked to Holland with the ideas of poldering, but we were looking for a kind of polder that could be open, so that it didn't need to always have a pumping system necessarily. But we're looking at the notion of berming through the extraction of sediment from canals, which are in this agricultural region, the Pudong area, and how those extractions could then be mounted to the side to create open shapes of canals, which would then help to retain some of that storm surge water. You can see all of these dark lines are canals that are running through this very heavily agricultural region, and then some later cuts going all the way from the Huangpu River up to the East China Sea. So we looked at two kind of continuous bands of chenier type extensions, but each within there's a small polder type openness, which would both slow the flow of a storm surge inward, but also retain some of that water, which is quite destructive on its outward flow. This is all in process. Again, we've been looking at models with water to see how the inflow and outflow are controlled. But again, importantly, the principles that we're looking at are not only the continuity of land and water, but also how, by using local techniques and local materials, in this case sediment, that you can create a more viable ecological system as well as creating a better place for people. Thanks.
Okay, questions?
Yeah, have you looked at any of the cost benefits associated with any of these designs, particularly the U.S. projects and the regulatory impediments? I guess it's sort of two.
We ignored all regulatory impediments when we started with Harvard because we knew we'd get nowhere. I mean, if you talk about the coastline, there's about 80 bodies that all have jurisdiction, so we ignored everyone. But we did actually look into numbers, and we looked at what kind of materials and volumes of clean dredge and also construction soil that might be used to fill the islands. I think for the Delta project, the Mississippi Delta, it's very much legislation. I mean, it's congressional legislation determining the 70%, 30% balance of the flow of the Mississippi. So that's something that would actually, but we saw it as something, if you were very careful and were able to kind of create a legislationary projection, like through the charts where you're basically distributing things through percentages, in a way you're mimicking what nature might do in its own natural swing, but you're actually using a kind of structured, engineered approach that could be amenable to a new congressional bill, perhaps.
Is the Mississippi plan being subjected to review because of the drought?
Because of the drought? Meaning that there's not enough sediment?
Well,
or
what it means now, but I noticed that there's a sharp drop-off in outflow.
Yeah, well actually, if you look back to the 2011 floods, there was a huge inflow of sediment. So obviously drought is increasing and it's continuing on that upward. Historically, we're entering this period of increasing drought. You know, this is really looking at maximum flow from spring tides. So the droughts are happening in July, August. I'm not sure what the trend would be. No, we didn't address, to answer your question, no, we didn't address the drought. Yes?
Yeah, now that we're left with this image, did you do any research in the Lingang New Town, which is in the very far reach of Shanghai? This,
where is it? Am I warm?
Before the circle. Going down.
It's the circle. No,
yeah, it has the giant man.
Oh, this thing out here?
Yeah, the little circle.
Yeah, well, we're really curious about what that is.
I just
There's a
went
new highway that's cutting
this
across.
summer, actually.
You were there?
I was there this
Did you
summer.
take pictures?
I did. I took pictures. And there's, actually they use geotubes to construct that entire peninsula, which is a sort of
see if I can find an
in
aerial
addition
view.
to the Shanghai proper
Hang on,
paradise.
we'll go back. Might see it better here. You can see it actually in this image. I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Well, we thought if anybody could do this project, it would be the Chinese. They have the wherewithal, the top-down approach.
Well, you can also see in this image too, like right the river is quite shallow, and so the road that leads, I've been there too, by the way, it's fantastic. And if you take the road, there's a deep water port is actually that, if you take the road south, there's a big bridge. So if you go to Lingnan, like the new town, like here. So what they've had to do is they moved the entire port south. The Chinese, instead of like worrying about all the dredging here, like this is the deep water port now. And so they've actually just moved the port to a place where it's deep enough to get the cargo ships to.
That's great, then we don't have to worry about dredging inland.
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah.
Hey, Catherine, one last question. Phil started this off with I think, an interesting notion about complexity. Phil started us off on this session with some notions about complexity and difficulty in forecasting.
Right.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your process. You're working on a huge scale.
Yeah.
The complexity of that, and sort of you're not forecasting, you're being a little bit more propositional about
Right.
dealing with complexity. I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the process we've been working with. The first thing we do is create that digital model that's seamless terrain. That's not easy to do. It doesn't exist, and we actually have to plot, put points in GIS 1,000 times to actually create that model, because we have NOAA and USGS, they work separately and their files are not merged, and the datum is not always the same either. So we have to create a uniform datum between the data sets and create a continuous surface. So then we have something that's continuous. Then that enters the question of like the projection. That was also something that came up earlier, thinking forward into the future and how complex that can be. And that's the kind of questions of climate change and what is the rise. Do you consider a bathtub just filling up 2 more feet with water? Are you thinking more about storm surge taking off from that height, or how land is compacting in some parts of the world more than others? And so sea level rise is either increasing or decreasing locally. There are a lot of complicated questions, and we wanted to test our design interventions, and so we actually ran this model at Princeton with EdCirc, and it was very, very difficult for the engineers to actually run a model from the ocean to the water. They had to do this thing in the digital model called pre-soaking the model to get everything wet, and then you could run our simulated hurricane through, and we got some results, but it basically took an entire supercomputer to run this. We returned to the water table techniques for immediate response to actually what basic fluid dynamics would be doing. But there are so many complicated, complex problems. I think it's a huge, in terms of testing proposals, that's what we're trying to work on now, is like how can we actually do something where you can test the results that you have to propose first and then test afterward.
On the Mississippi Delta problem, is there a way to preferentially divert the sediment as well as the water, or?
We're assuming the sediment is coming with the water. Yeah, and there's a number of, like, after the 2011 spring tides and the flooding that occurred then, a lot of sand showed up in a lot of places where the Corps had blown out their control structures. So I don't know enough about sedimentary behavior to know which water has more, but certainly certain times of the year have more. So depending on when, you could probably get into a kind of algorithmic method of opening particular diversions to attract the most sediment at the right time. That might be one way to do that, but I think that the notion is really that you allow the sediment to move and settle rather than to fall off the ledge off the continental shelf as it does now.
Any last burning questions?
How are you disseminating these proposals to stakeholders? I mean, like the China example?
China, we're not done yet. We're going to be exhibiting that in January in China, so that will be the first dissemination. We'll hopefully publish it soon after. We published on the Water Palisade Bay, and so I think that was widely disseminated. In the Mississippi, we've been working with LSU and the Coastal Sustainability Studio and 2 engineers down there who are hydraulic geniuses, and I'm not sure how that can move forward because it is a very, it's fraught with complications. But yeah, we're definitely speaking to a lot of people. We've spoken to the city, I know that Mary's here. A lot of people know about the work.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.